Hi everyone, and welcome to the very first Virtually, a free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference brought to you by Nomensa. Over the next 3 days, you will hear from some of the world's leading thinkers and doers in the field, people that are doing incredible work to ensure that there are no barriers for anyone accessing the web and future-proofing our digital products and services to ensure that they can be used by everyone. The need for accessible products and services has never been greater, and this has been brought into sharp focus over the last 18 months. Lockdowns has given us no choice but to head online to do just about everything, from socializing to buying groceries and everything in between. As the world becomes more and more digital, we all have a responsibility to ensure that there are no barriers to access. The web, after all, is for everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we really hope you enjoy the 9 sessions we have coming up. The first of 3 you'll hear today. This afternoon, we've got 2 great talks from Chimi Kalu of Triptease with practical tips for designers and developers to ship accessible products immediately, and Alicia Jarvis of Scotiabank joining us from Toronto with her talk, Inclusion by Design. Opening the conference right now, though, we have Nomensa co-founder and Director of Accessibility, Alastair Campbell, who'll be running you through what's coming next in WCAG 2.2 and what you should be doing with the new guidelines. Before I hand over to Alistair, I'd like to mention that we're always on the lookout for talent, both full-time and freelance. If you're interested in joining us, we'd love to hear from you. As always, please say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any issues with the stream. Please do ask lots of questions too using the Q&A function, and I'll get through as many as I can with Alistair at the end. And finally, a huge thanks to One-to-One Captions and Jane, our stenographer, for providing live captions today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alistair to kick things off.
Thank you, Henry. And yeah, as he said, this is WCAG Next. What I'll be going through is a little intro into the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'm sure everyone's aware of them, but I just find it can help to get over some of the sort of myths and misunderstandings that have built up around them. I'll go through what will probably be in WCAG 2.2. I say probably, just it's not finalized yet. I'll make that clear later. And what to do with them. So if you get through to the end of this talk, what should you do with these guidelines? So to give a quick introduction, digital accessibility, obviously, it's about how people with disabilities use technology. But in this case, the technology might be adapted or used in a different way than you might be used to. And the platform standards, things like HTML, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, iOS guidelines, help to define who's responsible for what. So what we'll really kind of focus on today is the platform kind of standard side of things, particularly on web content, which really help to create a baseline responsibility for people creating products. And they're used by governments to inform laws, procurement laws, public sector guidelines, things like that. However, you know, and it's probably worth realizing then where these guidelines are drawn from. So where do they come from? Well, originally it came from W3C, formed by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, who kind of has a benevolent dictator for life status there. And the W3C shepherds web standards like HTML, CSS, and accessibility guidelines. And that was because right from the start, the vision was that this is for everyone. It's a membership organization. So it's not that the W3C employs lots of people who write standards. It's actually organizations like Google, Microsoft, Apple, specialist organizations like Nomensa, who essentially volunteer people to sit on the committees, write the guidelines, write the specifications, raise issues, iterate on things. So it's unfair to sort of say the W3C does something. It's the members of the W3C that do things. And from an accessibility point of view, back in the early days, there were no accessibility guidelines. And you know, thinking in the sort of late 90s, governments and policy makers around the world wanted to have some way to assess accessibility, but there was no standardized way of doing it. So there was a real danger of, you know, every country or region coming up with their own guidelines to apply to the World Wide Web. which would have been most unhelpful. So I think W3C spotted that as a problem coming up. And they took a whole ecosystem sort of point of view. The end user has a browser or other means of accessing a website. Designers and developers create sites, maybe using some kind of authoring tool, content management system, or in the old days, things like Dreamweaver. So there was a whole kind of ecosystem going on. Today, we'll focus on the content guidelines, and they became really important because testing with the user agents as a method of working out accessibility gets quite tricky. I mean, we're all familiar with different browsers that people use, and there can be differences in how browsers do things. But when you consider people using access technologies, you get this whole plethora of possible user agents all working in different ways. This is a small selection. You know, I've got on screen icons for things like JAWS, NVDA, Dragon, Zoom, some of the Apple equivalents, and yeah, there's a whole plethora of these things. Some of them work together. You know, you can have different inputs and different outputs at the same time. So if you were creating a kind of matrix of testing for these, it wouldn't just be like two-dimensional. You'd have 3 or 4 dimensions, and you know, a huge amount of different things that you would be testing to try and say this product is accessible. So we need an abstraction layer, a way to say that the website is doing its bit without spending all your time in testing. So, you know, just to sort of highlight that difference, if you think through just creating a customized drop-down menu of some kind, do you then want to have that multiple kind of matrix of things, or is it going to help to have essentially a standard to refer to? Now, it is still worth testing with assistive technology, but if you go the standard route first, and then test a few of the popular ones, you're going to get to a better place more quickly than if you just went down the sort of testing with devices route. So starting off, there were a lot of sources of issues going back to the 90s before the accessibility guidelines were formed. And quite often they start off as a user requirement, e.g., you know, a user with such and such disability needs to be able to do something. That has to be transformed into content requirements. And, you know, the different sources were usability testing, surveys, people's experience, academic research. But there was definite filter on what got through. So it's not everything that affects people with disabilities. It has to be feasible to deal with. So there needs to be some technique to deal with that requirement. It needs to apply across different technologies. You know, it doesn't help if it's just only applies to HTML. It should apply to EPUB, PDF, other technologies you get on the web. And you should be able to apply across all websites. You know, it's no good if a particular guideline only works on personal blogs and doesn't work on e-commerce websites. So things which didn't apply across all of those kind of areas wouldn't make it through to become a guideline. So just having the sort of history of that there, we had WCAG 1.0, I think it was in 1998, 2.0 was in 2008, and then 2.1 was released in 2018. So looking at where the guidelines come from, I quite often describe these as kind of like antibodies. So the guideline or the criteria, the requirement we're looking at is trying to hook onto a particular accessibility barrier. So that accessibility barrier might be poor contrast. So there is a guideline that says there must be a minimum contrast. It might be inappropriate structure. So what you try and do is craft a guideline that will hook onto that inappropriate structure or that issue, and only that issue. We don't want to be catching other things at the same time. And just as a kind of structure example, on the left, I'm showing it's actually the Nomensa homepage, but with all the color and background stripped out. And you can still tell, you know, which things kind of look like headings, and what the kind of general structure of the website is. Whereas on the right, it's not just the colors and backgrounds that have been stripped out, but it's all the sizing, the layout, the spacing, and it just comes across as a stream of text and not very useful or readable. So that's what I mean by, what's an appropriate structure. It's quite flexible, but things that are visually apparent should be apparent from the structure as well, things like headings. So what is a content guideline? If you sit down and think, well, what would I make an accessibility guideline? You've probably come up with something from a user point of view. So users can navigate by headings and lists when appropriate. Again, it's a sort of screen reader orientated requirement. But that tends not to work as a guideline that's used by designers and developers, because how do we know when things are appropriate? Is it technology specific just to HTML? It also requires you to know what users can do with their technology. And as I've said, there's a big variety of that technology, so that makes it very difficult. So the guideline that's related to this, the actual one, is that information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined. So it's basically saying if something looks like a heading, make sure it's marked up as a heading. And it's, I admit, not as easy to understand, but it is more applicable and doesn't require you to know how different people use their technologies. To give you an idea of the sort of structure of the guidelines, there are 4 principles. You may have heard of POUR, which is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Those are basically sort of big categories. And then we've got smaller categories of the guidelines. Again, they tend to be quite high level. So it's things like make test content readable and understandable. Sorry, I think it's text content, readable and understandable. What people generally mean when they say the guidelines is actually the success criteria. So those are testable statements about website content that is known to improve access for people with disabilities. So an example of that would be the default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. So when people talk about guidelines, they usually mean success criteria. I do the same thing, don't worry about it. We kind of know what we mean. And the guidelines are also structured into levels as well. Level A is generally critical. There are people who won't be able to access the content if that guideline is not met. Double A, again, can be essential. Significant barriers would remain for some people. And then AAA is useful, possibly essential to some, but would often require some change to the design, to how things look and feel for everyone, or it may not apply to all content, or it might be much more difficult or infeasible to do in practice. But generally, there's the bigger the barrier is for people, the higher it would go, but the more of these factors like it being infeasible or not applying to all content, the more likely it is to go down that scale as well. And in terms of the structure of the guidelines, I'd say the most important link for each guideline is the understanding document. So each guideline has an understanding document. So if you click through to it, because the actual success criteria text isn't that clear to you, it should massively expand on that and actually tell you, why it's a guideline, who it helps, and what you can do about it. So when people talk about guidelines, they usually mean WCAG. And it's worth kind of realizing how that interacts with testing. So there's various accessibility testing methods that people often use. So originally, as I said, the guidelines were based on people's experience, either through usability testing surveys or experts. That's what formed the guidelines. And when you open up an automated tool or a review tool, those are using the guidelines to provide those answers. They may go beyond them. They may add other sort of things that they think are important. But in general, they are going to give you scores based on the guidelines. And so for these different methods of testing, we do recommend testing with people. people who have disabilities. And that's really good for testing a live site, for knowing how to prioritize issues better. It's very good for learning and persuading stakeholders and other people that accessibility is important, and here's why we should be doing something about it. There's nothing like seeing a real person struggling with something. But it's not quite so good for site-wide or even in-page coverage, because typical users going through a task like buy something on an e-commerce website, there'll be large swathes of that website that they never look at or get to. So it doesn't tend to get as good coverage, and it can be more expensive than other methods. So yeah, it is good to do, but there are probably certain sizes of organization or certain points of a project where it's most appropriate. Then testing with the guidelines is great for those sort of per page checks, particularly at later stages of development. You can get a good coverage if you pick representative components that you can then systematically fix across the website. It's good for saying you've done your bit. Tends not to be so good for inexperienced testers. I mean, everyone can learn. But what can happen if you're not careful is I find a lot of inexperienced testers tend to find too many problems. They'll find things that aren't really problems, reading a bit too much into the guidelines. And then automated testing is great for very wide coverage. There are some tools you can point to a website and it will spy the whole thing. And you can also integrate certain tools if you've got a kind of a build process. So in the sort of core development, it might run certain tests, and you can integrate an accessibility tool with those tests. What it's not so good for is depth of coverage. So automated tools will pick up roughly 30% of the potential accessibility issues, and no automated tool can tell you you've actually met a guideline for any of the guidelines. Because there are ways of sort of getting around them. So just to kind of summarize that, I've got a diagram on screen which along the horizontal axis is the kind of range of accessibility and usability issues. And then on the vertical axis is sort of what sort of coverage you're getting. So as I was just talking through, testing with people gets you the whole range of issues, but not necessarily across very much of your site or application. A manual audit will get you much better sort of coverage. You'll get a bit more sort of coverage of the website, and it will find all of the kind of agreed accessibility barriers. And then automated testing won't find as many of the barriers, but you can cover the whole website or application. So where we've got, we had originally 2.0 came out in 2008. That was updated for 2.1. And why did that happen? Well, technology changed a bit, or quite a lot, in fact. So although the guidelines came out in 2008, they would have been mostly written by 2006, and then touchscreen devices started becoming really popular around 2010-ish. And shortly after that, several sort of task forces were formed, which were experts in mobile technologies, cognitive issues, low vision issues, and they put together a whole bunch of user requirements. So it was very much focused on, if you have low vision or cognitive impairments, what are the things that are issues for you post WCAG 2.0. That was worked on to create actual guidelines from that. We started off with something like 60 proposals. 29 were worked on during the sort of iterations. I think 17 actually got through as new criteria. It was published firstly as a draft in 2017, and then it got to the sort of latter stages, candidate recommendation and final recommendation in 2018. And I'm not going to read out all the criteria. It's available in the WCAG 2.1 statement, but it was a lot on mobile and voice. a few on low vision, a few on cognitive, and a few sort of miscellaneous ones such as animation and status messages. And then WCAG 2.2 is where we are at the moment in terms of coming up to draft. We started in 2018. We were picking guidelines mostly from things that didn't get into 2.1 with a couple of extras. We started drafting those in 2019. We had a first public working draft last year. We've got a second public working draft right now. So now is a fantastic time if you want to review the new standards and raise any issues. And we're aiming for that to become what W3C calls a recommendation, which basically means an approved publication towards the end of the year. So I'm going to go through the new criteria, but bear in mind, we are in the review process. Any of these possible new criteria could disappear, or they may change drastically. So this is kind of a sneak preview, but just please bear those caveats in mind. So for these possible new criteria, well, I've got a list here. I'm going to go through all of them, so I won't read them out. But we'll start with accessible authentication. And for each of these, I'm going to start off with my kind of hopefully understandable summary, and then I'll go into a little bit more of the detail. So my summary of this one is don't make people memorize or transcribe something to log in. Now, obviously, that's aimed at things like passwords and having to type in random things, which is a real issue for people with cognitive impairments. We do obviously have to account for security issues as well. Accessibility doesn't trump security or vice versa. So we're not saying you can't use usernames and passwords, but if you do, make sure you don't block password managers or things like this. And there are other methods that are now becoming much more popular. This one didn't get into 2.1 because things like WebAuthn weren't quite ready at that time, but you have options such as WebAuthn, where you can log in with your device. That works on Windows computers, on most phone devices, I think Mac OS now as well. So basically, the browser offloads the authentication to the device. You also have things like third-party OAuth methods, like the sign in with Google type things. So the full detailed guideline is for each step in an authentication process that relies on a cognitive function test. At least one other authentication method is available that does not rely on a cognitive function test, or a mechanism is available to assist the user. Now, cognitive function test obviously becomes key there, and that's any task that requires you to remember, manipulate, or transcribe information. So that's things like memorization, transcription, use of correct spelling, performing calculations, or solving puzzles. That gets a lot of things like capture and certain second factor things. There are already mechanisms where as a user, I don't have to transcribe things. So I can copy paste from one to another. There's a YubiKey in one of the pictures on screen. So that's just a little button that you put into a USB port, and there are phone versions as well. And it asks for the password, you click, or ask for your authentication, you click the button, it logs you in. So only the person with that key can get in, basically. Memorization also doesn't apply to things about you like your name, email address, but it would be anything that the website is asking you to memorize. Dragging movements is fairly straightforward one, actually. So basically, don't rely on dragging. Include buttons or some alternative method. That's my simple explanation. This builds on the pointer gestures guideline in 2.1. But where pointer gestures, that's level A, and it only applies if you have to do a particular movement, swipe right, for example. Dragging applies to anything where, you put your mouse or finger down and have to move it to another location. So this one is double A. And all functionality that uses a dragging movement for operation can be achieved by a single pointer without dragging unless dragging is essential. So this one isn't about keyboard access, it's about people who maybe have mobility impairments, but are still needing to use a mouse pointer or a finger tap. Consistent help. If you provide a help mechanism, then provide it in a consistent location across pages. So this is a really good example of a criteria where it's very difficult to say all websites should have a human form of help, like a phone number or something, because not all websites can, particularly I don't want to put a phone number on my personal blog, for example. But where this kind of got whittled down to was essentially, if you are providing that kind of help, then make sure it's in a consistent location. So for the complete guideline is that for each web page within a set of web pages that provides one or more of the following ways of finding help, access to at least one form of help is included in the same relative order on each page. I'll break that down a little bit. So the set of web pages aspect means that if you have a subdomain that uses a different template, looks quite different, that's a separate thing from your main website. You don't have to provide the same help mechanism each time, but it should be one of those that are mentioned. And the same relative order bit just means that, if you have it in the top right, it should still be in the top right. The reason it doesn't say the same location is because of how flexible the web is. So the same location on your desktop view is not necessarily the same location in your mobile view, for example. Yeah, we can't say the same location, that doesn't work. But if it's in the same relative order, then at least from a coding point of view, that's quite clear. And then we've got a couple of guidelines on focus appearance. So in 2.0, there is focus visible, but it doesn't define how visible things need to be. So at the AAA level, we've got a guideline that basically says, ensure the focus indicator is at least equivalent to a contrasting 2-pixel outline. And I've got two little animated examples. I won't do too much animation on this, but there are a couple. The top one is just a 2-pixel black border around a light colored button, and the bottom one swaps the light background for a dark background and polarizes the text. So the AAA one is simpler because it is more strict, if you like, and just says, right, in fact, let's go to that. There needs to be a minimum area. There needs to be a change of contrast, and change of contrast is actually the concept that was really missing from the previous versions, because all of our previous contrast guidelines have been around adjacent contrast, things next to each other, but that doesn't help with a dynamic thing like a focus indicator. And it also says the focus indicator shouldn't be obscured by the author created content. And the reason we got to these ones is that there were really three things that affect the visibility of the indicator. So the first is how big the change of color is, or rather the change of contrast. So going from a light to a dark, essentially. And in the top example, we've got a light gray outline on a white background. So that doesn't stand out very well. Obviously, the size of the change makes a big difference. So in the second example, it's a thin one-line indicator just on the left of a rectangular button. So that's very small, harder to see. And then actually the adjacent contrast does matter as well. So if you've got different colors, if you've got a dark button, which we have at the bottom, with a 1-pixel dark outline, that's very hard to see. You can, as it animates, you can see it slightly changes the size of the button, but it is quite difficult to see. So when we get to the AA version, the change of contrast has to meet the 3:1 ratio, which is the same as we use for large text and non-text contrast. So that's the change aspect. And then at AA, we were trying to be more flexible. So it should be at least as large as a 1-pixel thick perimeter of the component. Or it could be at least 4 CSS pixels thick along the shortest side of the component, and no thinner than 2 CSS pixels. So that takes a little breaking down. It's worth realizing where that is useful is if you've got like one of these rectangular buttons, and if you had an indicator that was on one or both sides, and the button gets wider because you've got more text in it, suddenly it might fail, whereas the shorter button doesn't fail. So we wanted a metric that allowed people to have that kind of one side or different shapes that doesn't change just because you put more text into something. So that's why we have those 2 different size measures, and they're both area measures, basically. So anything you do that meets that same area. So for example, if you had a 100 pixel square as your component, you're looking for a 400 pixel, it's actually just under 400 pixel area for the focus indicator. And then we also want a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against the adjacent colors, or a thickness of at least 2 CSS pixels. So the bottom example, it has a blue button with a dark red outline, and those don't contrast. But the indicator is 2 CSS pixels thick, so it makes the button look significantly bigger. And then the last one is that it's not fully obscured by the author-created content. So that tries to tackle a problem where you have, well, actually I have an example. So on this page, I'm tabbing down the page. And as I tab down, the indicator gets hidden by the sticky footer. And then as you tab up, it gets hidden by the sticky header. So there are simple ways to deal with this. CSS, there's a CSS padding kind of attribute that can keep the focus in view. But this is why essentially we have this guideline: don't completely hide, don't let those focus indicators get hidden by other content. So the full guideline, I've taught this through already, but essentially we want a contrasting area, contrast change. We want a minimum area for that change, good adjacent contrast or good thickness, and then not to be obscured by author-created content. So that is definitely the most complicated of the new guidelines. And this is what happens if you have to define things like what is a visible focus indicator. So to tackle that problem, we had to work through quite a few areas, essentially. So the next one, page break navigation. So this is fairly tightly scoped. If you publish an online book with page numbering, then you need to add a navigation mechanism to get to the pages. So for web content with page break locators, a mechanism is available to navigate to each locator. I've got on screen an example. If you open up a Kindle book in your web browser, it has the sort of page indicators. And this is really useful in an educational context. So if you've got a teacher in the room saying, everyone turn to page 50, and people are using electronic versions of the book, it's really useful to be able to get to page 50. Now, obviously, these online books tend to have sort of percentage locations as you go through. But they do tend to have the actual little markers inside them that says this is the page 50 of the paper version. So if you provide that, make sure there's a mechanism. If you publish an EPUB book, that will generally have, the EPUB readers will have it built in, but it's the browser-based ones that don't tend to have this built in. Visible controls is another one from a cognitive point of view, where using mouse hover to make things apparent can be quite problematic. So I've got a little video clip of Squarespace where if you, well, basically it looks like a standard web page with no editing controls at all. And it's not until you mouse over things that you actually get those controls appearing. So what this guideline is basically saying is where you're using hover or keyboard focus to trigger interface components to become visible, there needs to be some information to identify that it's available. So for example, in that Squarespace example, you could have a pen or a little pencil icon next to the things that you can edit. You can then get more controls appearing when you hover, but if there's no indicator at all that there are controls there, that's where it would fail this guideline. And there are a couple of exceptions. If there is somewhere else on the page to do the same thing or as part of the same process, then that's okay. You can rely on that hover. If it's specifically for keyboard navigation, like skip links, that's okay as well. And if there is a mechanism to make it persistently visible, that would be okay. Or if it's what we call essential, and that might be that actually it's some kind of game that you're playing, and hover, having controls appear on hover is essential to that game. Target size is building on a AAA one that we had before, saying that targets should be 44 by 44 pixels, with quite a few exceptions. And this turned into quite a tricky one, partly because there are interfaces like document editing toolbars, where you want sort of quite a few tightly packed icons, buttons. And we did have some comments when we were using a larger value that some people with low vision actually didn't want these targets to increase, because when they're zoomed in, they would lose content, essentially. So the level in terms of the size came down during the development of this guideline. And we also wanted to incorporate spacing, so that it's less about, you know, targets being a minimum size, and it's really about not making mistakes. So if there is space around a target, that really helps for two reasons. One, if you miss, nothing else happens, you don't hit something else. And two, quite often, particularly touch screens will have heuristics that as long as you get quite close, it will hit that target. So basically the guideline is to allow for 24 pixels of size and or spacing. That's actually much easier to say in English than it is to create a testable version of that. So the actual success criteria is targets have an area of at least 24 by 24 CSS pixels, except where the target offset is at least 24 CSS pixels. And there's a definition of that, which is basically this little diagram where you measure the target from its kind of furthest point away from the nearest target. And if you've got that target size plus spacing as 24 pixels, that's a pass. It doesn't apply to targets in a sentence or block of text, or if it's essential, such as you might have map pins in a zoomed out view that are going to be very close together, and there's not much you can do because they have to point to the correct place. So redundant entry is basically don't ask for information twice in the same process. But if you did ask for it twice, make sure it's available for the user to select and copy, essentially. So there's quite a few processes where it will ask for IDs multiple times or your address multiple times, even if it's, you know, home address, and please add your home address again. I'm sure we've all come across those big kind of government forms that tend to do that. So the actual success criteria is that information previously entered by or provided to the user that's required to be entered again in the same process and the same session is either auto-populated or available for the user to select. And there are some exceptions. So if it's essential, if it's required to ensure the security of the content, for example, where you have to put your password in twice, or where previously entered information isn't valid. So it might, you can ask people something again For example, if you were trying to book a holiday, you'd put in your hotel information, and then you actually switched a destination, you would have to put your hotel information again. So that would no longer be valid. So that was a overview of the new success criteria. And what should you do with these? I mean, in general, what should you do with the content accessibility guidelines? Well, consider that they are a baseline for avoiding accessibility issues. So it is very much a kind of a minimum requirement. What I recommend is not trying to learn and apply all currently 50 criteria at the same time. It'll be 58 at AA with these new ones. But work out when and who should apply each. So for example, you might make the page structure into a sort of design problem, essentially, and say, right, I would like a, when we're doing designs, let's make sure we have another layer on top that annotates the headings and landmark structure. So there's all sorts of things where you can, if you actually go through the guidelines and think about your process, when is it that each one of these apply and who in your team should be responsible for that? And make them your own. And I don't mean create your own guidelines. I mean, take the guidelines, work out how you're going to implement them, and have that as your kind of internal documentation, as your process. I did that. There's another talk I did with Lee Mortimer, who's at the NHS. And yeah, we went through, and as part of updating their service manual, it was a case of, well, we're not going to use the guideline language. We'll use this language that we understand and more than meets the guideline. And they very much went above and beyond, and it was easier. The guidelines are there to work across every kind of possible website. So it's hardly surprising that they aren't specific to any website. So if you make them specific to your website, you can make easier guidelines that at least meet them and usually go beyond. And it's easier for you to understand. It's easier for you to implement in most cases. Yeah, make them your own. And once you know when they should be applying, it's much easier to test little and often. So a few checks, when you're developing some sketches, a few checks when you've got the design, a few checks when it's being implemented, and then a QA process that should check everything, but everything should have been defined already. So, and then as you go through that, where you find new things, new requirements or issues that got through, feed those results back into your kind of artifacts. So design artifacts, coding, component guidelines, component libraries, and things like that, and update your process if that helps. But you should think of the guidelines very much as the reliably testable accessibility area. That is not all of accessibility. There is quite a lot outside of that that isn't part of the guidelines. So that's why it is good to do usability testing with people with disabilities. And outside of that, you have sort of usability as a whole. And then the automatically testable accessibility is good to do. It's good to have that kind of hygiene process in place if you are running development processes, but you do need those manual checks as well. And just talking that through in terms of kind of a visual for that kind of virtuous feedback loop. If you have a project that goes through from discovery through design development Q&A, and you find new things, feed those back into your policy guidelines, code libraries, design patterns, brand guidelines. Just make sure that next time you start a project, it takes account of everything you've already found. If you are interested in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there is a kind of editor's draft you can review now. And in fact, I will tweet out a couple of links after this. We actually do have the most recent draft is now public. I will tweet out the exact link that goes through to these new success criteria. And you can add issues. It's entirely up to you if you'd like to pop in, if you see something that you think needs to be improved, please do let us know. So I should also mention Silver, or WCAG 3, which is on a longer timeline, but people may have heard of it. I don't want to kind of leave that sort of gap. It's being worked on kind of in parallel. It's got a completely new conformance model. So that means it's basically looking at, instead of just testable statements that are true or false, it's looking at other ways to score things so that it's not quite so binary. So you might have one or two little issues that aren't going to have much impact, and you can still conform to the standard. But it's aiming to be a bit more flexible, to get slightly better coverage of different disabilities, and to be easier to cover non-browser technologies. So things like, we've got virtual web technologies coming through now. So we're looking for a bit more flexibility in terms of how they can be applied. So that is all the material I wanted to go through. Henry, how are we doing for questions?
Brilliant. No, thank you, Alistair. Well, that's such a great talk. So interesting to hear all about the new guidelines. We've got a few questions through. But before that, I know a few people have been asking about when the recording will be available. We'll have this on YouTube as soon as the conference closes on Wednesday afternoon. And I think, are we okay to circulate your slides as well, Alistair?
Yes, I will make a couple of little tweaks so the PDF comes out okay, but yes.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Cool, yeah. So first question we have from Marion. Marion asks, is there anything specific we should be careful of when conducting usability testing with users with disabilities beyond disability etiquette?
Well, there's I do a whole training session on that that lasts about a day. I mean, to summarize it, there's lots of little things. And it's not so much to be careful of as to get good value from the sessions and make sure everyone's happy at the end of them. So for example, it is best for you to go through, whoever the test facilitator is, to go through the journeys using similar technology to the participants will be using. Otherwise, you could easily hit a dead end and not know how to recover from that. So it's important to have kind of a full rounded knowledge of how the session could go in order to sort of provide proper guidance for the user. And yeah, there's basically be very flexible. So, if they can bring their own technology in, or if you're doing remote testing, that's good. And in which case, if they are doing remote testing, then you need to be very aware of or to use whichever sort of software like Zoom that we're using now that they're familiar with, not just the one that you can use.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. Next question from Laura, who asks, are there any automated test applications that you would recommend?
We are kind of agnostic in terms of which technologies. I know, as a team, we've probably used most of them. It tends to be pick the one that seems to fit your process best. Because we do a lot of testing for our clients, we need a slightly different setup from actually what our clients would have. So they need something that is going to run regularly, give useful results for them. So it tends to need quite a lot of customization. I mean, the names that come to mind, there's plenty of providers. Tenon, I think Paciello Group do one. There's lots. There's nothing I particularly recommend. My recommendation would be test several and use the one which fits your process best.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So next question, I have another question from Marion, who asks, some assistive technologies are obvious, like screen readers, although there are many of them. Others are less known, like high contrast mode on Windows. How can you make sure to offer the maximum compatibility despite their wide variety?
Well, that's partly what the guidelines are there to help with. Oh, and I'll just point out, I can kind of see a few questions going past in chats, but if they're not in the Q&A, we might not get to those. Yeah, I mean, that's partly what the guidelines are there for. So as I said in passing earlier, design to standards, including things like if you're doing complex components using the appropriate way ARIA patterns, and then do testing on the fairly kind of usual ones. A Windows-based screen reader, a Mac-based screen reader, and then essentially that's your kind of optimized route, as opposed to trying to test everything. Windows high contrast mode is a particular one, but I think there is a browser plugin, at least for Edge and Chrome, that simulates that as well. That's usually a case of just being careful about not killing outlines and things like that.
Thank you. So next question from Dan. Dan asks, is the Web Accessibility Directive and other legislation likely to update to reference 2.2 when it comes out?
That would be a question for the EU Commission, I suspect. I wouldn't anticipate it updating anytime soon. I think there will probably be a reasonable delay, and they may even not update things until WCAG 3 comes out, but I don't know. And I also don't know if that will affect us in the UK either. I don't think anyone knows.
So next question, which has been submitted anonymously. Should we now be testing against 2.2? They say, I think the document is still a working draft, but should we still be incorporating the new additions into our testing?
I would recommend starting to incorporate it into your testing, but if you're testing on behalf of a client, for an organization, be very clear that these particular issues aren't kind of official yet. They are likely to be, but I wouldn't necessarily prioritize them in the same way as anything up to the 2.1 issues.
Awesome, thank you. Next question we've got from Matt Lawson. Hi, Matt. Matt says, great presentation, Alistair. Thank you. When will 2.2 become the W3C recommendation?
Yeah, I think I had that up here, which was should be towards the end of the year, assuming we don't have drastic changes to make from this current review. Then yeah, we should be on target for sort of autumn, or at least late this year. There's a few bureaucratic things we have to go through after the review.
Awesome, thank you. Next one we have from Martin, who says 3.3.8 redundant entry is annoying for everyone, and where it occurs on a site, it seems like poor interface design. Can you say a little about the specific accessibility barriers that led to the creation of the criterion?
Yeah, it came from the cognitive task force. So it was basically for people with memory impairments or other cognitive issues that are particularly impacted when you have to do things. And there's also the spoons theory is worth looking up, which is where lots of little issues can kind of build up to eventually put you off a task or prevent you from completing a task. So yeah, it's very much from the sort of cognitive side. And if you have a look at the let's see if I can pull up the link. There's this document from the cognitive task force, so making content usable for people with cognitive learning disabilities. And there is loads more in here. And these are the kind of things it's very good to be aware of and to build in, but they're just not things that you can point to content and have a binary yes/no answer about. They're much more contextual. So they're still definitely good things to do from a cognitive point of view, and build in almost, it ends up being much more usable. But they just weren't things that we could get in as guidelines.
Thank you, Alistair. So next question we have from John. John says, I have an issue with alt text and cannot find the issue addressed. It concerns informative, not descriptive text that is on screenshots, in inverted commas, of videos, e.g. YouTube or Vimeo. The text is artistic and probably not readable by screen readers, which is problem number one. And the text is longer than 150 characters, which is problem number two.
I am not sure I understand what the problem is there. I mean, if the text is artistic, that doesn't actually impact whether it's read by screen readers or not. Don't get rid of that question yet, Henry. I'm still reading it. The alt text defines that, which is a background attribute that's actually in the code. So it doesn't actually matter what the text looks like. And then if it's more than 150 characters, again, these days, we've done testing, 300 characters will be read out, at least. That's why I gave up testing it, because it then becomes very long and probably shouldn't be alt text at that stage, just because it takes a long time to go through. So, John, I'm not sure I understood the question, but it sounds like there's probably a problem there, but I'm not sure what it is.
Well, thank you. So we've got time for a couple more that I can probably rattle through quickly. Next one from Bob. Should WCAG be used or a local amended version?
That sounds like what I was talking about towards the end about sort of making it your own. So I would recommend have, by local, I don't mean like an English or UK version. I mean, if you're in an organization, your organization's version, because I know there's nothing going to put people off more than, if you copy paste WCAG into an intranet page and say, right, we've all got to do this. You need to translate it in a way that's relevant to the audience. So it's pulling the bits out that are relevant to their work, and just making sure that whatever you put in meets the WCAG guideline, but you can make it specific to your context.
Thank you.
So the answer is yes, carefully.
Cool. We think we've got time for one more. Next one from Simon. Re 3.3.7 accessible authentication, a common method of two-factor authentication, is time-based one-time password. As a user, I read a 6-digit number from an authenticator app on my phone and enter it into a form field on a web page. Will my web app be compliant if users are required to do this?
So the answer is no if they do have to transcribe a 6-digit number from one place to another. But I would note that at least the Microsoft Authenticator app is available, and you can set that up so that it becomes like a notification that you just tap on instead of having to type it in. I don't think Google Authenticator supports that, but so long as your web site allows you to use the Microsoft Authenticator version, for example, then that would work. And there are other mechanisms. So you can still use that one-time code, but you have to make sure there's another method as well, which could be done by YubiKey or WebAuthn.
Cool. Thank you. I know there's a couple more questions there, but I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. But I'm sure if you reached out to Alistair on LinkedIn or Twitter, I'm sure he'd be very happy to answer your questions there. Again, thank you, Alistair, for a great talk. Thank you, to one-to-one captions for our live captions and to everyone else that tuned in. As mentioned earlier, we are looking to grow our accessibility team here at Nomensa. We'll be tweeting out details of how to get in touch with us and apply. Next up, we have Chimmy Kalu at 1 p.m. UK time with practical tips for designers and developers to ship accessible products immediately. There's still places available, so if you've not signed up yet, there is still time to do so. Alistair, thank you very much again, and thanks everyone, and we'll see you back at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.